Welcome to another deep dive, this time into the nature of trauma. We've got some really interesting excerpts from Catherine Malabou's book, Post-Trauma. Specifically from Chapter 9, she really gets into how we understand trauma in the modern world.
It's a fascinating read. Malabou challenges some pretty deeply ingrained ideas about how trauma works. She pushes back against Freudian psychoanalysis and even some contemporary neurological approaches.
Oh, wow. So right off the bat, we've got some conflicting viewpoints. Always fun.
Yeah.
To simplify it a bit, it seems like the classic view is that trauma is always linked to the past.
Yeah.
Like reopening an old wound. But Malabou uses insights from neurobiology to argue for something different, right?
Right, exactly. She's interested in what she calls destructive plasticity. This is the idea that trauma, particularly severe brain trauma, can actually create a completely new person, someone totally disconnected from their past. It's like if you think about shattering a mosaic, you can't just put the pieces back together the same way.
Wow, so not just resurfacing old wounds, but like a whole new landscape of the self? That's intense.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
And this leads us to Malabou's critique of Slavoj Žižek. Žižek is a prominent philosopher and psychoanalyst. He argues that trauma has always already occurred.
Okay.
He's building on the Lapanian idea, which is that there's this fundamental underlying trauma that shapes us as individuals.
Hold on. Always already occurred.
Right.
So, like before we were even born, we're already traumatized.
Mm-hmm.
How does that even work?
Well, to understand Žižek's point, I think it helps to picture the symbolic order as a giant library. This is where we store all of our knowledge, our language, and our understanding of how the world works. But Žižek believes that just entering this library, entering this world of language meaning social structures, that this itself is inherently traumatic.
Okay.
We're separated from this kind of primal unity with the world. And that separation leaves a mark. So any later trauma, like an accident or a violent event, it resonates with this original foundational trauma.
Okay. I'm starting to see how this connects back to the idea of trauma being rooted in the past. Like we're always carrying this invisible baggage with us. But if that's the case, how does Malabou challenge this with her concept of destructive plasticity? She's approaching it from the angle of neurobiology, right?
Right. And her argument hinges on what happens in cases of severe brain trauma. She points out that this kind of trauma can completely disrupt our neural networks. And this creates a break with the past that isn't about reliving old wounds, but it's about a radical change to the self.
So going back to our library analogy, it's not just about rearranging some books. It's like a fire that destroys entire sections of the library, irrevocably changing its structure and the knowledge it contains.
Exactly. Malabou argues that this kind of break severs the connection to that always already idea of Žižek and Lacan. The person after the trauma becomes disconnected from the symbolic order, essentially the framework of meaning that we use to make sense of the world.
So this really challenges the idea that everything is predetermined by our past. If trauma can rewrite us so fundamentally, where does that leave our sense of identity, our sense of continuity? It's almost like becoming a different person.
And that's precisely the point that Malabou is driving at. This idea of destructive plasticity disrupts the neat narrative of trauma as just a repetition of the past. It's a much more radical and unsettling concept. To understand it better, let's look at a specific example that Malabou uses to illustrate her point, the burning child dream that Freud analyzed.
Okay, let's unpack this dream. First, can you remind us what the dream is actually about?
Certainly. In this dream, a father is watching over his sick child, who eventually passes away. The father is exhausted and lies down in the next room. He leaves the door open so he can still see his child's body. An old man is tasked with keeping watch over the child. The father falls asleep, and he dreams that his child is standing by his bed saying, "Father, don't you see I'm burning?" He wakes up and discovers that the old man has fallen asleep. A candle has fallen over, and his child's body has been partially burned.
That's a heavy dream. So how did Freud interpret this? And more importantly, how does Malabou use it to make her case?
Well, Freud was interested in whether this dream could be seen as a wish fulfillment, as he believed most dreams were. Lacan, in his interpretation, focuses on the concept of the real. Now, instead of saying the real, maybe we can think of it as the raw, unprocessed experience that lies beneath our attempts to make sense of things. Lacan suggests that the dream stage is an encounter with this real, a traumatic kernel that's beyond our ability to understand or explain it.
So for Lacan, the real trauma isn't the literal burning of the child's body, but something deeper, something tied to this idea of the raw, unprocessed experience.
Exactly. Lacan distinguishes between two types of events in this dream. He calls them touché and automaton. Now, touché refers to chance, to the seemingly random event of the candle falling and the burning. Automaton, on the other hand, represents the necessity of the traumatic encounter. He argues that the touche the burning is just a mask for the underlying automaton, the encounter with the raw, unprocessed experience, the traumatic separation from the child.
It sounds like he's saying that even chance events are ultimately driven by this deeper, predetermined traumatic structure. Like, even random things happen for a reason tied to this underlying trauma.
That's the gist of it, but Malabou vehemently disagrees with this interpretation, and this is where things get really interesting.
I'm all ears. How does Malabou turn this interpretation on his head?
She argues that sometimes the traumatic event is the real. It's not a symbol for something else, not a stand-in for some pre-existing psychic wound. In the case of the burning child, Malabou suggests that the burning itself, that shocking contingent event, that is the primary trauma.
That's a big departure from the traditional psychoanalytic view. So she's saying that we need to give chance its due when it comes to understanding trauma, that sometimes things just happen, and that in itself can be the trauma.
Absolutely. Malabou wants to give chance its chance. This challenges the notion that everything is determined by the past, that every trauma is a reenactment of some original loss. She argues that the burning child dream can be read as a demonstration of destructive plasticity. The candle following the burning creates a new reality, a new traumatic inscription that can't be reduced to the father's pre-existing psychic structure.
That's a really interesting perspective. So you're saying that instead of focusing solely on unearthing past trauma, we should also consider how the event itself has fundamentally changed who we are. Like in this case, the burning isn't just a symbol, it's the event that causes the trauma and reshapes the father's reality.
Precisely. And this is especially relevant when we consider the impact of brain damage, which Malabou uses as a key example.
Okay, let's explore that a little further. How does brain damage fit into her argument?
Malabou argues that brain damage, particularly severe trauma, this is a form of trauma that quite literally shatters the symbolic order. Remember that library we talked about? Brain damage can be like a fire in that library. It disrupts the order, makes it difficult to find meaning. It disrupts the very neural pathways that allow us to make meaning, to connect with our past, to construct a coherent sense of self.
So it's not just a metaphorical shattering, but a physical one as well.
Yeah.
Like the very foundation of our understanding is damaged.
Precisely. The symbolic order is like a language we use to understand ourselves and the world. Brain damage can disrupt our ability to speak or understand that language. It's a form of trauma that defies easy explanation, that resists being integrated into a pre-existing narrative. It becomes the new reality.
This raises a really important question for me. If trauma can be this disruptive, if it can rewrite the self on such a fundamental level, how do we even begin to cope with it? How do we help people heal from such profound experiences?
That's a question Malabou grapples with, and it's one that traditional psychoanalytic approaches may struggle to address. If trauma isn't always rooted in the past, if it can be a radical break with who we were, then the healing process might need to look very different.
That's a lot to think about. It seems like Malabou is pushing us to reconsider some very fundamental ideas about trauma. But she doesn't stop there, does she?
Yeah.
She also talks about a new form of violence emerging in the modern world, right?
Yes, she does. And this is where her analysis becomes particularly relevant to the world we live in today. She argues that we're facing a kind of violence that blurs the lines between what we consider natural, political, and socio-symbolic trauma.
This sounds intriguing. Can you give us some examples of what she means by this? What kind of events fall into this category?
Certainly. Malabou points to events like 9/11, natural disasters like tsunamis and earthquakes, and even things like brain tumors and Alzheimer's disease. She argues that these events share a kind of disruptive force, a capacity to inflict trauma that can't be neatly categorized or contained within traditional frameworks.
It's like the boundaries between different types of trauma are breaking down. We're living in a world where we're increasingly vulnerable to forces that can shatter our sense of self, our understanding of the world, in ways that are unpredictable and often difficult to grasp. It's a bit unsettling.
It is. And this, according to Malabou, is the new face of violence. It's a violence that challenges our traditional ways of thinking about trauma, a violence that demands we expand our understanding of what it means to be human in a world where the ground beneath our feet can shift in an instant, where our sense of self and understanding can be so easily disrupted.
This has given me a lot to think about. We've covered so much ground already, but it seems like there's still so much to explore. Where do we go from here? What does all of this mean for us, for how we understand ourselves and the world?
Those are excellent questions, and that's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we spent some time really unpacking Malabou's idea of destructive plasticity.
Yeah.
It really is a powerful idea. It challenges this whole notion that trauma is always tied to the past.
And, as we discussed, it really throws a wrench into some traditional psychoanalytic thinking. Malabou argues that some traumas just shatter the symbolic order so completely. Trying to analyze them through the lens of the past just doesn't work.
Right. It's not about finding some hidden meaning from your childhood or whatever.
Right.
It's about understanding how that event itself rewrites the present.
Precisely. Malabou argues that the traumatic event becomes like the new reality.
Okay.
And it reshapes the individual on such a fundamental level.
We talked about how brain damage is a prime example of this kind of trauma. And you use this really great analogy, the library fire, to illustrate how it disrupts that symbolic order.
Yeah.
But beyond the physical, what are the broader implications of this new reality that Malabou is talking about?
It's a shift in perspective, really. Instead of viewing trauma solely as something to be overcome or healed, we start to see it as a force that can reshape us, a force that can lead to some pretty profound personal transformation.
So it's not about erasing the trauma, but about integrating it into this new sense of self. This is a pretty radical concept.
It is, and it challenges us to rethink those traditional notions of resilience. It's not about bouncing back to some pre-trauma state. It's about embracing the change that the trauma inevitably brings.
Okay, that's a lot to process. I mean, it makes sense logically, but it also feels kind of daunting.
Yeah.
How do we even begin to wrap our heads around this idea of embracing change on such a fundamental level?
I think one way to approach it is through Malabou's critique of Lacan's analysis of the burning child dream. Do you remember how Lacan focuses on that underlying symbolism of the dream? The separation from the child as like the true trauma.
Yeah.
Malabou really pushes back against that. She argues that the burning itself, that actual event, that is the primary trauma. It's not just a symbol for something deeper.
Okay.
And this is where her concept of chance comes into play. She argues that we need to give chance its chance when it comes to understanding trauma.
So instead of seeing every event as predetermined by our past experiences, we need to acknowledge the role of chance in shaping our lives.
Precisely. And this is especially important when we think about these new forms of violence that Malabou identifies. Events like 9/11, natural disasters, global pandemics. These aren't just individual traumas. These are collective experiences that reshape entire societies.
Right. And they often seem to come out of nowhere.
Right.
They disrupt our sense of order and security. It's like the ground beneath our feet can shift at any moment.
Exactly. And that's the point Malabou is making. These new forms of violence, they're unpredictable and often impossible to fully grasp. They challenge all of our existing frameworks for understanding trauma. And they force us to confront the fragility of our world and really ourselves.
This is all starting to feel very relevant to the world we live in today.
Yeah.
It seems like we're constantly bombarded with all this news about crises and disasters. It's almost like we're living in this perpetual state of low-grade trauma.
I think you're right. And this is where Malabou's work becomes so crucial. It gives us a new language, a new set of tools to understand and navigate this increasingly traumatic world.
So it's not just about individual healing, but about recognizing that collective impact of these new forms of violence.
Exactly. Malabou is reminding us that trauma is not just a personal experience, it's also social and political. It's about the systems and structures that make us vulnerable to these kinds of events in the first place.
So this is making me rethink our whole conversation about resilience. It's often framed as this individual quality, but maybe it's something that we cultivate together, something that emerges from our relationships and our communities.
That's a powerful insight. And I think it points to a more hopeful vision of what's possible in the face of all this trauma. It's not just about surviving. It's about creating those spaces where healing and transformation can actually occur. Spaces where we can support each other through these really challenging times.
So what would that look like in practice? How do we actually create those spaces? What are some concrete steps we can take?
That's a great question. And that's something we're going to explore further in the next part of our deep dive. We'll delve into those practical implications of Malabou's work and discuss how we can cultivate resilience in ourselves and our communities in the face of this new era of trauma.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Catherine Malabou's post-trauma.
It's been quite a journey.
It has.
Exploring her ideas.
We've covered so much ground, from destructive plasticity to this whole new understanding of violence and resilience.
Yeah, a lot to think about.
Definitely a lot to digest.
Yeah.
In that last part, we were talking about how trauma, especially these new forms of violence that Malabou talks about, how they can reshape us in these really profound ways.
Yeah, and how this reshaping isn't always negative.
Right.
Malabou challenges us to see the potential for growth and transformation that can emerge from these experiences.
Right. It's not about erasing the trauma or pretending it didn't happen. It's about somehow integrating it into this new and evolving sense of self.
Exactly. And this leads us to the question of what we can actually do with these insights. How do we move forward in a world that feels increasingly unpredictable and even traumatic at times?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Mm.
We've talked about the need for new frameworks for understanding trauma and the importance of cultivating resilience, both individually and collectively.
But what does that actually look like in practice? How can we apply these ideas to our daily lives?
Okay, so let's get practical. Where do we begin?
I think one of the most important things we can do is to cultivate a sense of radical acceptance. This means acknowledging the reality of the trauma, the pain that it's caused, and the ways in which it's changed us. It's about resisting the urge to deny it or minimize it or intellectualize it.
So it's about being present with the discomfort, with the messiness of it all, rather than trying to force ourselves to feel better before we're ready.
And this leads to the second principle, patience. Destructive plasticity. It's not a quick fix. It's a process of unfolding, of becoming. And that takes time. It's about allowing ourselves the space to grieve, to heal, to integrate that trauma into our own narrative at our own pace.
I think that's so important. There's often this pressure to just get over it, to move on quickly from difficult experiences.
Yeah.
But true healing takes time.
It does. Rushing the process can actually do more harm than good.
Right.
So we need to be gentle with ourselves, allow ourselves the time and space that we need to heal.
So acceptance and patience are key.
Mm-hmm.
What else can we do to kind of navigate these challenging times?
Connection is crucial. Trauma can be incredibly isolating.
Yeah.
But healing rarely happens in isolation. We need to reach out, connect with others who understand what we're going through.
This makes me think about the importance of therapy, or support groups, or even just having a trusted friend or family member to talk to.
Absolutely. Having a supportive network can make a world of difference. It's about creating spaces where we feel safe to share our experiences, without judgment, where we can be vulnerable and know that we're not alone.
And you mentioned earlier that Malabou also emphasizes the importance of social and political action.
Yes. Many of the new forms of violence that she identifies are rooted in these systemic issues. Inequality, injustice, the destruction of the environment. Addressing these root causes is essential if we want to create a world where people are less vulnerable to trauma.
So it's not just about individual healing, but about collective healing, about working to transform the systems and structures that contribute to trauma in the first place.
Yeah, that's a critical point. We need to kind of address both the individual and collective aspects of trauma, creating spaces for healing and growth while also working to change the conditions that make us vulnerable to these experiences in the first place.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into post-trauma, what's one key takeaway you hope our listeners will hold on to?
I think the most important message is this. Trauma, even in its most destructive forms, it doesn't have to define you. It can break you open. It can shatter your world. But it can also be the catalyst for profound growth and transformation. So embrace the change. Cultivate resilience. Connect with others. And never underestimate the power of the human spirit to heal and to create something new and beautiful from the ashes.
Beautiful. Thank you for taking us on the thought-provoking journey. It's definitely given me a lot to reflect on.
It's been my pleasure. Remember, trauma is a complex and multifaceted experience, but within that complexity, there's also hope. There's the potential for growth, for transformation, for a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
We'll leave it there for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into post-trauma. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of the ideas that shape our world.